Hello everyone, thanks for joining us tonight. My name is Heather Stewart. I work as a Biodiversity Officer at Cardinia Shire. Cardinia Shire acknowledges that we are on the land of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Thank you for attending our Gardens Wildlife Workshop. This session is on butterflies and bees, and it's been by far our most popular session. So I'm looking forward to all the chat and the questions tonight. Gardens Wildlife is a free program for Cardinia Shire residents, showing you how to create a garden that attracts wildlife and improves habitat. Due to the COVID restrictions, we've had to move the program online, which has enabled us to try out these new online workshops. The program is a partnership between Cardinia Shire Council, Landcare Networks, friends groups and local volunteers. If you complete tonight's workshop, you'll be sent a link to register for a free plant voucher valued at $20 for the Cardinia Environment Coalition Nursery based at the new Deep Creek Reserve. The nursery will be open from the 30th of April this year and will be home to the Gardens Wildlife Project. So you'll have plenty of time to plan out your new garden and then go use your free plant voucher. Deep Creek is Council's premier environmental site. It has a natural playground, wetlands, cafe, golf course, and now an Indigenous plant nursery. You can plan a day out with your friends and family and start your Gardens Wildlife adventure. I'd like to introduce you to our gardening presenter, Richard Rowe from Sustainable Gardening Australia. He will guide you through tonight's presentation and I will be staying to answer all of the questions. So grab a cup of tea or a glass of water or whatever drink you want and sit down and enjoy the next hour of the talk. Thanks so much, everyone.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Heather. And welcome to everybody who is joining us tonight. Let me just start by sharing my screen here. I'd also just like to recognise that I'm on Wurundjeri land, in Lower Plenty here in northeast of Melbourne. So tonight we're going to talk about two particular types of insects that can often visit our gardens and what we can do to actually try and stimulate them and to encourage them to come and visit our gardens. So namely the native bees and the butterflies. Now, before we make a start tonight, for those who are new to our webinars, so your cameras and your microphones have been turned off, but you can ask questions. So certainly if you've got anything that you want to ask me, certainly pop it into via the Q&A button. And so we'll be able, Heather will keep an eye on that and we'll make sure that we answer questions by the time we get to the end of the session tonight. If you have just some general comments or observations or things you'd like to share, resources, for example, then you can also put those into the chat. But try and keep the questions in the Q&A if you can. This is being recorded and there will be speaker notes that will be issued as well when the recording is loaded up, and that will be available in the next couple of days. Now, before we do make a start, I just wanted to have a quick little poll just to see who we've got on with us tonight. So 3 questions should just quickly jump up onto your screen in a box. One about, have you heard about SGA? What sort of garden that you have and how many people are watching your screen tonight? So if you quickly answer those, and we'll see what sort of mix of people we've got tonight. So I'll just let that go for another 10 seconds or so. Oh, we've still got a few new ones. As the further we go down in this program, because we've got quite a few of these webinars, the more and more people answer that they've heard about SGA, but we've still got a good 30% who haven't been involved before. So I'll give you a quick little intro about SGA shortly. Okay, so I'm just going to apologise to anybody that I cut off in mid completing the poll, but I just want to make sure we move on relatively quickly. So I'm going to end that now and just share the results. So there's still a few people there, 8 that haven't heard about SGA. So I'll give you a quick summary of SGA in a moment. And our garden types, there's a couple in pots and containers, and certainly with butterflies and bees and native bees, there's certainly a lot you can do in pots and containers that you'll get out of tonight. all the way up from small gardens up to large, with the large garden being the largest portion. And quite a lot, 5 couples sitting in there tonight, so welcome to them, and everybody also on their own there tonight. So let's make a start. Very quickly about SGA. So SGA, or Sustainable Gardening Australia, is a non-for-profit organisation which focuses on providing people with education and resources to help them live a healthy life, but also to look after the environment by what they're doing in the garden or in their garden. So it's about protecting the natural environment, growing food at home, having a veggie garden, and building community. So you can find us online at our website, sgaonline.org.au. You can find us also on social media. And when on our website, you can also subscribe to our monthly newsletter, which has new articles each month about gardening sustainably. We also have a Friends of SGA group, and this is about us building a community around us for a little bit of a financial support. Helps us continue on to do the stuff that we're really passionate about doing. And for that $25 annual fee, you get an additional newsletter called Flourish, which comes out 3 or 4 times a year. Discounts to our masterclasses, which are other training events, and also discounts to some of our business supporters, who are mainly seed companies and plant companies. So certainly jump online to our website and find out more about that as well. But what we're here to talk about is some of the smaller animals in our garden. Australia is really blessed with the diversity of life, but also of climates and regions that we have. And it's estimated that in Australia there is about 250,000 insects, of which only about 80,000 have been identified or named at this stage. So you can see the diversity and the depth of what we still don't know about this these small little creatures in our country. About 2,000 plus native bees, about 400 plus butterflies. Now here's an interesting thing, 20 to 30,000 moths, so they far outweigh the butterflies, and about 30,000 species of fly. We often think of the normal little annoying black fly, but there are over 30,000 species of flies in Australia, all doing interesting things around about pollination, about predation on pests, and also in decomposition of natural resources. So lots of things that they're doing. So what we're going to talk about tonight is a couple of the wild pollinators, and this is a term which is given to those little creatures that pollinate our native plants. Now, often we think of the honeybee as being the pollinator, and that honeybee is actually an introduced bee. It's not native to Australia, and it is a very critical pollinator in our food system, whether it be in our agricultural industry, horticultural industry, or in our back gardens as well. Now, there's a little graph up the top there, which from an ag guide from New South Wales Department of Primary Industry, that shows that honeybees, very important in the amount of pollination and yield with our fruit and veggie crops, I suppose. But then above that, the native bees that we have are equally as important. So you add the two together and then you have a very high yield coming along with our plants. So native bees are really, really important. So the next little graph down the bottom is from the wild pollinator count, which happens twice a year, and there's one coming up in April I'll talk to you about a little bit later. This is the results from autumn in 2020. And what it is where people will sit down and record what insects they're seeing visiting one of their plants. And as you can see, top of the pops there, the honeybee. So even though it's introduced, it is a very dominant pollinator in our gardens and in our agricultural industry. Followed by hoverflies, and then the next one was native bees. So you've got the native bees, the general native bees, and then they separated out the blue banded bee because it's such a popular one as well. So you can see the native bees are a very important part of our pollination services, but it's not just the bees. So what are wild pollinators? Well, we do know about the normal honeybee, very big pollinators. You can see this one with all the pollen on its little combs there on its legs. But there are many, many native bees as well. There's also lots of butterflies that play pollination roles. They're looking more for nectar, but while looking for nectar, they'll help pollinate, as will moths and flies and ants and beetles, all sorts of different creatures in that small world of insects. There's also possums that pollinate, there's bats that pollinate, and many of our Australian birds are actually evolved to be not pollinated by insects, but by birds, the honeyeaters, for example. So they're, yeah, and even things like grevilleas won't get pollinated by insects. The way that their structure is, they need a bird to help pollinate them. And so it's one of the reasons why we have a very big honey industry in Australia, is that a lot of our flowers have been designed, or not designed, but evolved to be pollinated by big birds. Therefore, they have lots of nectar in them. And because there's lots of nectar, then there's also lots of resources available for the honeybee to make lots of honey. But what we're going to really talk about tonight is just two of those pollinators, which is the native bees, and we'll spend a little bit of time on the butterflies as well. But it's all not easy for the bees and butterflies and all of our pollinators. There's lots of things that are impacting on them, and there's things that we can do that we'll learn about tonight that we can do to help them and to increase their populations and health. Part of it is about habitat loss and the way that we've designed our urban areas, our gardens, our reserves and parks and things like that. Basically, a simple open garden or a simple open lawn area with minimum amount of flowers and plants is actually an environment that bees and butterflies won't like. And quite often we have a lot of open lawn areas, and we don't necessarily have a lot of complexity in our gardens, in our flowers. And therefore, that means there's not a lot of resources there for the bees and the butterflies. In these sort of situations, when there is a lack of resources, and it could be because of our garden structures, but it also could be because of climate issues. For example, we're going through a drought, and that means that there's a lot of competition for limited resources. And we know that the honeybee is very productive, and it will be getting a big share of those nectar and pollen resources, which means that there's less to share around for the other pollinators as well. So we can do things about that in our gardens. Also weeds, this is probably more of a case in maybe some of our bushlands and so on, but when weeds start to take, or environmental weeds start to take over, they actually remove a lot of pollination or pollen and native nectar resources that are available as well. So they can be a problem. We're going to talk a little bit about pesticides and the impacts that those can have as well. And as the climate is changing, it's affecting all sorts of things in our environment, including the flowering patterns and the nectar availability of our plants. And that's having flow-on effects with the bees and butterflies and other pollinators as well. So there's lots of things that can impact our little friends, the bees and butterflies. Now, where do they sit in this ecosystem that we sort of talk about each week? We've got the soil down the bottom. We've got all of our plants in the next level, which are feeding from the soil. And we've got our herbivore animals here, which includes the bees and the butterflies. So they're basically vegetarian, and they'll be looking for plant resources. So resources from our gardens that come from our plants. The other thing to remember is they are really important food sources for other animals further up in this pyramid. So yes, it's important and nice to see them as part of our pollination workers that are doing, and they look beautiful in our garden, but they're also really important food sources for lots of other animals as well. So it starts to build out the full ecosystem. So what can we do? Now I'm going to come back to this slide at the end of the session as well, but it's really as simple as this. It's trying to stop using insecticides and pesticides, and trying to increase the complexity or the diversity in our gardens, which means have lots of flowers, lots of plants, and especially some Indigenous ones as well. So if they're the two things that you take out of tonight, see how we can reduce insecticide, pesticide use, and how we can plant more plants with flowers. Now, the reason why it's important to reduce our chemical use is that insecticides and pesticides generally will be broad spectrum, which means that they just won't kill the ones that you want to die. For example, like the aphids, they can potentially impact all the different insects of that size. And so there can be a lot of consequences for using insecticides and pesticides. Even homemade or organic treatments. So just because something is homemade or organic doesn't mean that it won't also impact other pollinators or other insects. So even these homemade solutions and resources they're lower impact, but they can still impact the bees and the butterflies and other insects. The other thing to remember is that insects that have been sprayed with these chemicals, if they then get consumed by other animals further up the ecosystem or the food chain, well, then that can potentially have harmful impacts on those. So if a lizard eats some insects that have been, or some snails that have been poisoned, for example, then that can then flow on to impact the lizards, as an example. So with SGA, we will be putting out shortly a product guide, which you'll be able to find on our website. It's not available as yet, but this will basically you'll be able to search in it against different sorts of chemicals you might use in your garden, and you can see the impacts on a whole range of different sectors of biodiversity, including human health, but also bees and butterflies and so on. And then also that will help you identify, hopefully, some lower impact resources that you can use in your garden. So keep an eye out for that. It's not available as yet. There's still a few little hurdles that we have to jump, but it will be coming soon. But what we're going to talk about tonight mainly is our bees and butterflies. So we're going to start off with native bees, and this is a little resin bee. So a cute little resin bee. We'll hear a little bit more about them later. Now, bees can provide resources, so pollination resources in two different ways, and it depends upon how the flower groups have evolved. Now, I've broken the two ways of pollinating for bees into brush pollination and buzz pollination. And we're very familiar with what I call the brush pollination. This is what the honeybee does, and many of our other bees do as well. And I'll just show this little clip here. So basically, the bee is covered with hair. It has little combs. Many of them have little combs on their legs, and they collect the nectar, and they walk around, and it brushes off onto their body, and they collect it on their combs. And then they'll fly to the next flower, and they will take some of that pollen with them, and they'll pollinate the plant. So you get this transfer of pollen between plant and plant because it brushes up onto their body. The other type of pollination I've always called buzz pollination, and there's just less than 10% of flowers in the world that won't get pollinated by these sort of bees. They need a buzz pollinator. So here we have a little clip of a blue-banded bee, which is an Australian native bee. It's approaching a tomato flower. So all the flowers in the tomato family, like the capsicums and the eggplants, they all get pollinated this way. And what it does, it stops flying, it grabs onto the flower, and it vibrates. It vibrates its body, and that loosens the pollen. So it collects the pollen, then it can actually move on to the next flower, and then it will also do some cross-pollination and sharing the pollen around. But it's also there trying to collect the pollen for itself, so that it can make some bee bread, which we'll talk a bit later for its little babies. So that's a blue-banded bee. It's a little bit of a pin-up for the native bee world. It's quite a popular one, and there's lots of them about, and we're going to learn a little bit more about them later on. Now, let's have a look a little bit at the ancestry, or the bee family tree. So in Australia, we have both introduced bees and native bees. Now, I've split them up into two different categories for each. They're either solitary or they're social. So looking at the social introduced ones first, the main one we know about and we think about is the honeybee, the European honeybee, which is both used as an industry and for pollination of our fruit and veggies and so on. There's also, it's escaped, and it's in, what they call feral ones, or they're wild hives as well out there. And they're social because they have a social structure. They live as a unit. There's one female, there's one queen who's the mother of all of the bees. There's also some other social groups or types of bees. In Australia, there's this Asian honeybee, which is comes across into the Northern Territory and so on. It's more aggressive. It doesn't produce as much honey. So it's one we don't necessarily want to have in Australia. There's also the bumblebee, which is a European bee, which is in Tassie. And again, that's one that we don't want. We'd prefer if it doesn't come across to the mainland. So they're the social ones. On the solitary or the semi-social, we actually have some introduced ones as well, just a couple. A couple of them have just come in through some way, maybe through container shipping or something like that, but the alfalfa leafcutter bee was actually introduced deliberately to try and increase the production or the productivity in the pollination of canola, alfalfa, sorry, and so on. It hasn't been, my understanding, overly successful. There seems to be still a little population in South Australia, but it's not one that we'll necessarily see around. But on the native side, we also have social and semi-social solitary bees. Now, on the social side, there's what's called sugar bag bees. There's 11 species of these sugar bag bees, but unfortunately, they don't live down here in Victoria. They live mainly up in Queensland and northern New South Wales, where it's a lot warmer. They're very cute little tiny bees. They are stingless. They're often kept as a hive, a little hive. It's just a tiny little hive kept in schools and so on because they're stingless. They're a great observation point for the kids. But what we're going to spend most of our time on, because these are the native ones that we get down in here, Victoria, is the solitary and the semi-social bees. Now there's over 2,000, I think last I heard there's about 2,600 species of native bee in Australia. So that's a lot. Considering a couple of years ago, most of us actually didn't know that they even existed, and I include myself in that. And so over the last few years, their profile has definitely increased. Most of them are solitary, as I talked about. Therefore they don't store honey. So only the social ones will turn the nectar into honey. Many of these, or all of these, the majority of these native bees are not honey makers. The males are stingless. There are only 11 species of stingless females. So many of the female ones, the bees, native bees, are sting, but they are often very small, so their stings really aren't an issue for us with our thick skin. But also because they're not a hiving bee, they don't protect a hive, and therefore they're even less aggressive than a honeybee. So they really have to feel threatened if they're ever going to actually sting you. So it's probably still something you have to be aware of if you're anaphylactic. But as far as a risk profile for a bee goes, it's so much lower than a honeybee. Very important pollinator, especially for our native plants, but also can help you in your veggie garden. So the blue-banded bee, which you see here, is a very good pollinator of tomatoes. And even in the tomato growing industry, they're investigating how they can use the blue-banded bee and the teddy bear bee to help them with pollination. So very interesting little bees. And here's just a picture, some pictures. We'll go through in a little bit more detail later of some of them, but just some of the cute names as well. We have the reed bees, the teddy bear bees, the leaf cutter bees, resin bees, masked bees. I think you can tell why they're called masked bees. And the one I've mentioned a few times now, the blue-banded bee. So that's just a tiny little selection. Now, in our gardens, if we want to attract any sorts of wildlife, we need to be providing lots of resources. And for native bees, the food resource is nectar and pollen. Even though they don't make honey, they still need nectar and pollen. And they need nesting places and nesting resources. And so we're going to go through in a little bit more detail about some of those things shortly. But in summary, rather than get into the detail, in summary, it means having a good selection of different types of plants, not necessarily perfectly manicured, because we tend to take away some of the resources when we manicure our plants. And basically, anything that a honeybee likes, these bees will like as well. Now, honeybees actually the European honeybees need a body of water because they use that to help cool down and adjust the temperature in their hive. But a native bee doesn't necessarily need that body of water. It will be able to access dew on the plants and the flowers and the nectar and so on. So it doesn't need that additional water resource. And I'm going to talk a little bit about maybe using some bee hotels, not as the sole resource that you can provide in your garden, but as something to supplement and to act as a bit of an observatory point for you in your garden. And so they're a good supplement for a garden, but not just on their own. They won't necessarily be very successful. So with your flowers, with the food, it's about diversity. So it's about having dense clumps of lots of flowers. So flowers that, plants that have lots of tiny little flowers are very good. The blues, the pinks, the purples, the whites, the yellows are very good colours. So it gives you a very broad palette that you can use in designing your garden. And there's going to be a few little lists as we go through tonight, and these will be in your handouts of the types of plants that you could potentially plant from a native plant perspective: eucalypts, banksias, acacias. So you can imagine all the flowers and even the honey that we get from these types of plants: callistemons, grevilleas, melaleucas, correas, danellas, all sorts of different plants. Even on the exotics, so if you go into more your herb garden, love the lavenders and rosemaries and alyssums and all those sort of things, the salvia, sage family and so on. So lots of different plants that you can plant in. And the more that you have, the more resources that will be around. Now, there are a couple of plants that some people have that you just have to be careful of, because they can be environmental weeds because of the way they easily seed and the seed spreads. So the bedelias and the lantanas are very much in that category. They're beautiful plants, but they can spread relatively easily because they seed a lot. Now, there is a little citizen science program called Pollinator Observatories. And this is a little program where you create a little area in your garden or in a place or in a park where you sit down and you just watch and you observe what you're seeing, what plants, what insects are visiting. And this is an observatory that was done in under the Westgate Bridge, the Westgate Biodiversity area of the Bili Nursery under the Westgate Bridge. And what they found, they did the plot of this about what plants different insects visited. And the blue-banded bee, in this particular observatory, the blue-banded bee really liked the hopgoodenia, the austral stalkbill, and the pale flax lily. So they were the three that were most visited. The other native bees also visited the daisy type plants, the snow daisy bush in this case, the coastal banksia, or some of the banksias because of the amount of nectar, and things like the paperbarks that were in flower at the time. So this will vary across different locations and different times of the year. But it was just an interesting little example of, some of the plants that you could plant, especially, people love to have the blue-banded bee around. Well, there's a couple of different choices that you'd be able to look at to plant in your gardens. And these as well can grow quite well in pots and in courtyards. So they're not necessarily just the domain of the big garden. It can also be the small garden or the balcony garden, the courtyard garden, that can actually get some of these resources. Maybe not your paperbarks and your coastal banksias, but there's lots of other options out there.
Richard, is it time to stop for maybe a question now?
Yeah, if you've got a question, yep.
Yes. We've got one from Thornbill, and he says, "Hi, Richard. Is it true that hybrid native flowers are not desirable, e.g. those that are showy as they don't have as much nectar?"
In some cases it may be. All I would say is that if a flower has been hybridized and grown for its looks, there is a risk there that it may have less nectar. So it hasn't been optimized in its cross-pollination for nectar. So it's not necessarily a rule that just because it's hybridized means it will not have a lot of nectar, but it could be one of the consequences that they've been selected for their size or color and so on, and therefore they may have been inadvertently deselected for nectar quantity. But I'm sure that there's still a lot of plants out there that are hybridized that would actually still create a lot of nectar, because that's the way they still get pollinated as well. So they need to get the pollinators in as well. So, but I wouldn't say it would be that case for all of them, but it is a potential consequence of selection for looks and color and perfume, for example.
Thanks. We don't appear to have as many questions this week, so maybe people could put in the chat section any bees they might have seen in their garden. Because I think any garden, big or small, most people have seen a bee.
Excellent.
And some of them might have been lucky enough to see one of those blue-banded bees.
Yep.
I was so excited when I saw one. I kept
It's
trying to
funny,
take a photo, but it kept moving.
I tell you what, they are very fast, and
They
I've only
are,
got
aren't they?
I only use my phone camera when I take photos, and I've struggled to get. I will actually see one a little bit later, but I have struggled to get native bee, especially the blue-banded bee, because they're very fast.
We just have one more question that's come in, and that's, do European honeybees attack native bees? That's a good question.
No, they don't. No. So when honeybees are foraging, they're actually very passive. They've got a job to do, and they're very passive, and they'll just go around, look for resources. They'll flip from flower to flower. It's just that they're much more productive and can collect a lot more and a lot quicker. So they can outcompete maybe the native bees if there is a scarcity of resource. But I haven't heard of any situations where they're actually would actually attack. Because of resources, scarcity of resources or anything.
Fabulous.
That's it for the moment.
For now.
Okay. Now, this is just a resource that might be of interest to you. So there is a foundation called the Ween Bee Foundation. And so this is a non-for-profit, which is it's a worldwide foundation about protection of native bees across the world, and we partnered up with them last year along with the Royal Botanic Gardens and Rotary, and we're developing some little booklets which are available online looking at the different bioregions around Australia, and the three that we started off with are the three bioregions that ring Melbourne. So we have the southeast, the west, and the north Melbourne, and that's sort of the three bioregions around Melbourne. We've published the southeast Melbourne one and the western Melbourne, but not yet the northern Melbourne. And so this is a great resource for you to be able to learn a lot about bees and pollinators. And in addition, it has in the center of it a fold out. It's actually longer than this. I couldn't fit it any more on the screen, but of the different types of plants, their flowering, whether they're good for nectar or pollen, or when they flower, and what types of pollinators will actually like them. So the native bees and all that sort of stuff. So it goes through from ground covers all the way up to trees. And so you should be able to get some good ideas of some of the plants that you might be interested in planting in your garden, because it's especially important not just to have flowers, but flowers that try and cross all months of the year if you can. So seeing where there may be some gaps in your garden, you might be able to identify some additional plants that you could get in, which is nice for your garden to have flowers all year round, but it's those resources for the bees and pollinators as well. Okay, so nesting. We've talked about food, now we have to talk about nesting resources. Now, our bees still need to nest, and a lot of people don't know this, but about 70% of our native bees will nest in the ground. So they drill little holes in the ground. The other 30% will nest in plants of some sort, either in holes that have been drilled or bored out by a wood borer, or in the pithy part of a dead stem of a plant. So you can see here, there's a little bee here. It's only very small. And you can see here it's used this pithy stem here for its lay its eggs in there. So providing these resources for nesting in our garden is really important as well. So for the earth nesters, the ones that will nest in the ground, it's important to have a little patch of ground somewhere in your garden that doesn't have mulch. Usually I say mulch, mulch, mulch. But for the nest-bearing or laying bees, they need to have a little patch that doesn't have mulch. Some of them may even be doing it under your house. So if they can get access under your house, if you're on stumps and there's some access points, they may actually be using that space under your house for nesting. I've also heard of people maybe making little raised garden beds about 60 centimetres deep with some clay loam, sandy loam in there, some rocks and so on, and using that as trying to attract bees into there as well as a nesting place, so a specific place for it. With stem nesters, so these are the ones that will use the pithy stems of plants, then we need to put some of those resources in our garden. So things like roses, bamboo. I just realised I don't really have a lot of indigenous plants with a pithy, but the reeds and so on. But it's also important that you don't cut them out too quickly, because it's after they've finished their growth and that potentially they die, like the raspberry cane will die off, and then they will use them at that point in the life cycle as well. So sometimes it's not the neatest garden that will attract the more of these sorts of insects. So because in nature it's not necessarily that neat. There's also hole nesters. So these are the ones that will build a nest inside an existing hole in a tree. So as an example, our wattle family is very susceptible to wood borers, and the wood borers are a really important food source for all sorts of different animals, birds and so on, but also the hole that they leave behind is a very important nesting resource for things like some of the bees, the resin bees, for example. So important to think about how we can add some of these resources in our garden, and then to supplement that, not to replace that, but to supplement that, we can then think about, well, can I also put in a bee hotel? And again, following those 3 different areas, there's little bee hotels that we can have with tubes in them, for the stem nesters, like bamboo or raspberry canes, or even straws, paper straws, not plastic ones. We can drill holes in blocks of wood for those nesters that normally would go into a borer hole. We can make mud bricks for those ones that would normally do ground nesting. And then we can combine all 3 in an interesting structure. And so it's an interesting sort of DIY project as well. One thing to note, though, it's important with some of our nesting resources, if we're going to have a little bee hotel, that if we see that a part of it's being used, especially for the hollows like the bamboo and so on, that once it's been used, if it has been used, that we replace it, because over time they can accumulate fungal infections, mites, other diseases, and if they reuse them and don't clean them out, that can start to affect their health. So this is a picture of one that's got straw liners in it, and then if these get capped off and used, and you'll know that they've been used because they'll cap it off, they'll fill in the end of it, then you can replace the straw later on. So after the season's finished. So that's just one little thing just to be careful of. But then many bees actually still clean out them as well. So here's some examples of the hollow stem bee hotels, a lot of bamboo being used, but even paper straws. You can see here, these are the raspberry canes with the little holes in the middle, and these are homemade straws. Just be careful with a lot of the, I'm a little bit careful or cautious about the pre-made hotels that aren't Australian, because often for them to be able to be imported into Australia, they are fumigated with chemicals, and therefore those chemicals can then potentially impact the bees in their nesting and affect either their life cycle or breeding or and so on. So yes, it's nice to get a good cheap bee hotel from Aldi or somewhere like that, but just be really careful and cautious, because we don't want to be introducing all of these new chemicals into their life cycle as well.
So should we be looking for ones, Richard, that maybe are made in Australia? Would that help with that issue?
One's made in absolutely. There's not a lot of them around though, so
right.
Maybe it's a good little cottage industry that could be built up. There are some people that are making them, but they're actually, if you can get yourself some bamboo, they're quite an easy thing to make yourself. So it's a good little project that you can look at as well. The drilled holes, so these are the bees that would normally be looking for an existing hole in a tree, and things like the leaf cutter bees, mass bees, and resin bees. And these aren't ones that you would be able to replace as such. They will use them many times, but they actually clean them out. This is a bee hotel that I found, which actually is hard to tell, but there's a couple of the holes down here have been covered over, so it's either a wasp or a bee in there, so that was working. This is one that was of a colleague of mine, Guy Palmer in Eltham. He's got a bee hotel, and you can see these have all been capped off, and this is by a resin bee, and here they are the next year where they're all being cleared out again. And so he was having a lot of success with resin bees. And you can see here what they do is they basically build these little cells in their in these holes, and they'll lay an egg in each one of these. And what they'll do is they'll create a little ball of bee bread, which is a combination of nectar and pollen. It's like this little ball of pollen and nectar. They'll place a little ball in each one of these cells with the egg, and then when the egg hatches, the baby, the little grub, will then start eating. And so that's instead of having honey and pollen stored in a hive. So you can see there's many cells in here. And from what I understand is that the boys will be up the back and the girls will be up the front. And so if the holes aren't big enough, often there's going to be less girls than boys. To make these, you need a variety of hole sizes. So 3 mil, 5 mil, 6 mil, 13 mil for different size bees. And different depths as well. So this will be in your handouts as well. This is also available in the Australian Native Bee Act Guide. So it's 70 mils deep, 120 mils roughly as well. So quite deep. Have them so they're angled upwards a little bit, or so angled, angled downwards a little bit, sorry, so that the, so they, up, so the entrance of them is facing a little bit down so that water doesn't go into them. So it sort of sheds water. So that's also important. And if you can, try and use hardwoods rather than softwoods. It gives a bit of a smoother surface. And if you can burr off the edges of it, just because these bees can be quite tender. So if there's little splinters and things like that, that could harm them as well. So there's lots of little ideas there for building a drilled bee hotel. The other one is
can I just so we've got a couple of people who said that they can hear us, but they can't see the slides.
Can you
see them? I can see them. I'm wondering whether most people can see them. The only thing I've been able to suggest is maybe to log in and out again, because sometimes people maybe don't press the video button.
Haven't heard of
I'm
that
not
one.
going to pretend I'm a technology expert, so if anyone has any other suggestions to
there's a lot
the
of people
residents that are struggling.
A lot of people are saying they're having no issues. So it's obviously maybe if they log out and log back in. The other thing is that this is being recorded, so they will definitely be able to come back and watch the slides a little bit later as well. So I'm not quite sure what the issue is there.
No, so sorry to those people that we are keeping in anticipation, because I think they can hear everything that you're saying and they're wondering what all these fantastic images are.
Oh dear, that's very disappointing for those people. Not much I can do, unfortunately, but you will be able to see it back on the recording. Yeah. So the third one is the mud brick. And so you can make your own mud and it's sort of so you can see the bottom picture here. It's been made in a bit of PVC pipe. So you could use some sort of bottle or something, a plastic bottle to encase it. A good mud that will hold together and some structure. And you don't need to create the whole hole. You just need to maybe start a hole and then the bees will be able to dig out the rest of it. The ones that like this are, for example, the blue banded bees and the teddy bear bees. This is a little picture. These are my pictures here above. This is a little church in northeast Victoria, and I was there during autumn, I think it was, and you could see here. No, it was early summer, and you can see here. It's a bit hard to tell because I said earlier they fly so fast, but there were hundreds. All of these little dots here against the sky are all blue banded bees or native bees, and they were basically in all of the old mortar of this church. They were basically building nests in here, so they've obviously been doing this for years, and it was it's like a swarm of them. So in some ways they're semi-social because they will nest together, in a common area, but they will have their own nests. And so this was an amazing thing to see, but unfortunately I couldn't take very many photos because my phone, they just were too fast, but you can see one up here flying around here. So that's another thing you can add is the mud-based and create some holes. And then you can add those together all in one sort of like structure as well. So let's have a look at some of the little bees. So the blue-banded bee, a bit of the pin-up for the bee, the native bees. There's about 11 different species in Australia, and they're one of the bigger bees, 8 to 15 mils. So they are social to some degree. So you can see here, these are all the boy bees hanging off a piece of grass, just waiting around for the girls. So they sort of hang around together, but all the females will lay their own eggs. And so they're not like a hiving bee where it's only the queen. Metallic blue often, but not always. They can be more duller white in colour. And you will know that if you've got a boy, because they will have 5 bands, whereas the girls will have 4. Now, if you're seeing these bees on your flowers, it's most likely going to be the girls, because they're looking for the pollen and the nectar to be able to make the bee bread so that they can put that into the cells where the nests are. Whereas the boys really just need to get their own resources for themselves. So they often won't be seen as much as the girls. They are buzz pollinators, as I mentioned, so they will do their buzzing, especially around tomatoes. And they can actually also suffer from chalk brood, which is a fungal infection that happens in bees. So it's important that they drill new holes each time that they are nesting. So another one is the teddy bear bee. It's very closely related to the blue-banded bee, same sort of family. It looks very similar. It's a little bit bigger in size, a little bit more fluffier, which is, I presume, where it gets its name as a teddy bear bee. And there's about 25 species in Australia. And apart from that, it's very similar to the blue-banded bee. So the males will roost and hang together. The females can nest in the same location in aggregate as such, but in their different nesting holes. They're a buzz pollinator as well, and they use their burrows or in the mortar of old buildings, as we saw as well. So they're a very cute bee. The cuckoo bee is an interesting one. So there's a lot of cuckoo species in all of nature, and the cuckoo is one that actually lays its eggs in another animal's, and it gets brought up by the other animal as such. And the bees have that as well. And so this is actually the same church. This is the mortar. And so with all the blue-banded bees hanging around, there was also these cuckoo bees. Now these cuckoo bees, so they will then lay their eggs in where the blue-banded bee is putting the eggs. And so they have a hard exoskeleton, so they can't get stung, so they will get attacked. But they've got these beautiful blue, sort of neon blue colours on them. So they're quite an interesting bee as well. We have the leaf cutter bee. So the leaf cutter bee will cut out these little circles in your leaves. Have you seen that? It's because it's a leaf cutter bee. And they will wrap them all together within a hole, within wood or a bit of bamboo or something. And they will create a new lining each year for the eggs to be, and the bee bread to be put in. So they're an interesting one, 6 or 7 to varied, so from quite small up to larger, 17 mils, about 40 species of those in Australia. So that's an interesting one. You might have seen, you might not see them, but you might actually see the work of them through the leaf cutting. The resin bee, it will use the wooden blocks and it will line it with a resin and then it will cap it off with the resin as well. So it will clean out the hole and then reline it as well. So it's quite a good hygienic one as well, and cap it off. So you can see here the caps here, which have been capped off, and here's the resin bee actually in starting to build the nest or clean out the nest or something. The masked bee, these are a smaller one, sort of less than 10 mils. They've got different species, 150 in Australia, and they'll have different mask patterns, usually yellow on their faces. There's about 5 different species around Melbourne. And so these ones are hairless, so they won't get the pollen on their body, but they'll swallow the pollen to take it down to the nests. And we've got some resources that you can look into as well, be in your notes. The Australian Native Bee Ag Guide from New South Wales Department of Primary Industry. As I mentioned, the Powerful Pollinator booklets are really good. There is the Pollinator, Wild Pollinator Count has some resources on their website as well. The Ween Bee Foundation and the Aussie Bee website has got lots of good information as well. And coming up on the 11th to 18th of April is the Wild Pollinator Count. And so if you're interested, you can go onto the Wild Pollinator website and you can see how to do it. And so that's where you can become part of the citizen science project that is as well. So that happens twice a year, once in autumn and once in spring. Any more
Richard, is it a
questions
good
before we?
time?
Yep, before
Yes,
we
I
do
was
butterflies. Yeah.
just going to say I've been building up a few fabulous questions, so good time to ask those now. The first one, Samantha's asking, hello there. Just wondered how to tell the difference between spider holes in the ground and native bee holes in the ground. And I'll probably add there's also ant holes as well. So
There
how are we
is.
going to tell the difference between all of them?
Look, that's a really good question. All I can think, I've never thought of it before, but often I see spider holes, but they'll have a little bit of webbing around them as well. So they usually, I would have thought they would have some sort of web structure around them as well. Ant holes are usually quite small, but they'll oh, I suppose you've got the bull ants, but that will actually, because it's a big hive as such, that will be potentially quite a large sort of little structure there as well. If you thump on the ant hole, you'll definitely find out if there's ants in there. So
Good
I'm not
technique.
sure. Yeah, just be careful, especially the bull ants. They'll run for you. Apart from that, I'm not too sure. Maybe observe it and watch it for a while and see what goes in and out.
The next question we've got is there an ideal place to have your hotel? Where should we put one for a bee?
So the best place is facing the morning sun, a bit of shade if it can have afternoon shade. So you don't want the hotel to get too hot. They are cold-blooded, so a little bit of morning sun, sort of facing sort of east, southeasty, northeast sort of direction would be nice to have it as well. But yeah, protected from the afternoon sun so it doesn't get really too hot and baked in there, especially in the summer.
Awesome. The next question we've got is what recipe of mud and ratio to make our own hotel? And then also what depths do we drill for the hardwood? So ratio
The
of mud.
hardwood will be in the ratio, the depths are, it was either 70 or 120 mil, so that'll be in the handouts.
So that was the depth in the handout.
Yep.
We saw the second number.
Yeah, yep. So that'll be that in the handouts. You'll get that as well. And for it's just as long as it's something that will hold. So it needs to be a little bit clayey. I can't actually tell you the ratios, but it just needs to be a little bit clay, but still not solid clay. So some good sand mixed in with it to ensure that it will sort of crumble a little bit. So you think of the mortar, I mean, that's quite sandy and crumbly, but it still holds structure. So I don't know the exact proportions, but I wouldn't be putting just soil in there. I'd be making sure it has a little bit of clay content so that it can hold the structure when a hole is being drilled.
And one of our regular contributors, Thornbill, has mentioned above that there's a website called Australian Native Bees that apparently has some recipes for creating rammed earth/clay nest boxes. So that might be worth checking out too.
That's a good tip there. Excellent.
The next question we've got is, how many offspring do the different types of bees typically have? When do the adults die and do they die in their nests? So quite detailed there.
Yeah, no, they won't die because the nests are basically for the eggs, so they won't live in the nests. So it's only for laying the eggs. They can do up to three cycles in a year, and they can actually lay up to about 30 eggs in a year. Cool. So in a hive, so a queen bee will lay hundreds of thousands in a year, whereas a native bee, will be only like 30 or 40 in a year, and then it will die. So that's sort of a fairly short life cycle. They can live over winter as well. So if they get some nice warm places. So
do you have any recommendations for managing weeds? So Carly's saying she loves the idea of not using herbicides, but she's having trouble keeping on top of the weeds because we do have big properties in the Shire.
Yeah, look, a lot of it's manual. It's about using really good sheet mulching as well. If you've got lots of areas with lots of weeds, so putting down lots of cardboard and then put mulch on that, it basically smothers the weeds. Then it's about slashing and mowing, it's a hard one, I know, because the chemicals is where it's going to start to impact. Using chemicals is where it's going to start impact the other biodiversity, parts of biodiversity. So I do struggle with weeds myself, and so I've started to do sheet mulching around the place again to try and get on top of it.
And maybe people have the option of gradually phasing out their chemical use, so it's not so daunting all at once.
That's right. And so there are lower impact chemicals as well. So through phasing out, you can look at trying to use some that aren't as have as much impact, and then trying to phase them out that way.
And the last question we've got for this section is, any ideas on getting bees into my tomato greenhouse? They don't appear to want to enter.
Part of the problem maybe is it gets too warm in there. Again, if the climate's too warm, they may not necessarily want to get in there. Also, the normal honeybees won't be pollinating your tomatoes because they need to be buzz pollinated. So it's either the wind or a buzz pollinator. So you need to try and get the blue banded bees in there. But again, it just need to, if it's in a glass house, it potentially will get quite warm in there. So they may not find that attractive in itself.
Oh, and one more's just slipped in. And what about using Slasher, which is an organic weed destroyer? I've seen that one too. What do you think of that
Look,
one?
they certainly are a lower impact. There's a few different types. Slasher is one that I have used as well. I wouldn't be using it on big vast areas, but small areas of and using it very very thriftily would be okay. There's also ones that have clove oil and different sort of oils that are quite good as well. Okay, we'll quickly go on to butterflies. So we won't spend as much time on butterflies. So the butterflies and moths belong to the same family. It's I can never get this right, Lepidoptera family, which means Lepidos means in Greek apparently scale. So you can see here a picture of the scales that are actually on the butterfly wings, and Ptera is wings, so scaly wings. Now the butterflies, who we're going to spend most of the time with tonight, the adults have no mouth parts, so they feed off nectar. And while feeding off nectar, they can help to pollinate. So they have this little straw proboscis that basically they use to suck up the nectar. On average, they live 4 to 6 weeks only, so a fairly short lifespan as a butterfly. So butterflies and moths, there's about 400 species of butterfly, but there's about 20 to 30,000 species of moth. There are some very definite differences. Their antennae are different, so clubbed versus often furry. Their wings are shaped differently, so they stand upright versus flat. Butterflies are more colourful because they're out during the day, whereas moths are more dull because they're out at night. And the butterflies will metamorphose in a chrysalis, which is like an encasement, whereas the moths will spin a silk cocoon. So there are some differences. What we tend to see in our gardens generally are butterflies, although there are a few moths that will be around as well. In the butterfly family, there is 5 main categories. There's the skippers, the swallowtails, which are the bigger ones, the whites and yellows, the browns and nymphs, and then the blues and coppers, which are probably the smallest of them. Now, we don't have many of the big, large ones here in Victoria. The big, large ones, we've got a few, but the big, large ones, most spectacular ones, tend to be more in the tropical environments. But we have lots of these other ones around. And here are some of the local ones. These are the larger ones. There's the checkered swallowtail, the dainty swallowtail, and the orchard swallowtail. Then we've got some browns, which is what I often see a lot about, the swordgrass or the common brown, the meadow argus, a few little really beautiful little ones, the caper white and the Jezebel, imperial Jezebel, and then also on the grasses you often see the common blues as well, to these tiny little ones. There's many butterflies that are generalists in the plants they like, but then there's also quite a lot that have very specific relationships to plants. So the Eltham copper butterfly will only lay its eggs on the sweet Bassaria. The swordgrass brown will only lay its eggs on the swordgrass, and the imperial Jezebel will only lay its eggs on the native mistletoe. But there are others that are much more generalist in nature. There's 4 species in Australia of introduced butterflies. Only 2 down here in Victoria, being the cabbage white and the monarch. The European painted are mainly in WA, and the tawny costa is coming across from Asia and is in northern Australia. They can all be controlled through native parasites, so they don't necessarily get out of control. The monarchs you can actually buy and actually hatch them yourself. This is probably the biggest pest for the gardener, which is the cabbage white on our brassicas generally. And so butterfly gardens are easy. It's about understanding the full life cycle of the butterfly. And with a butterfly, it's a numbers game. They will lay lots and lots of eggs, but only about 1% will actually turn into a butterfly. The rest are eaten at either the egg stage, the caterpillar stage, or even at the butterfly stage as well. So the eggs are parasitized, they're eaten as well. The caterpillars are eaten by birds and parasitized as well by wasps. So they're actually a really, really important food source for other sorts of animals. So yes, they're beautiful to have in our garden, but they're actually an important part of that food system as well. So what we need for our butterflies is solid food for the caterpillars, liquid food for the butterflies, potentially some shelter, which is just our garden. So maybe some rocks around for them to warm up because they are cold-blooded and they need to get moving in the morning in their cold mornings in spring. And then breeding plants, well, they will basically breed on and eat the resources. So having a butterfly garden generally means you need to accept that you're going to have some damage to the plants. But unfortunately, it's often we associate major damage through things like the cabbage white, which can really get into our brassicas. Whereas a lot of the others, the other native butterflies, don't actually cause that huge amounts of damage, and it's not as noticeable. So the sorts of plants that you would be planting as a general nature are things like the wattles and the bush peas and the purple panflowers. A lot of the grasses are really important, native grasses, and a lot of the caterpillars will also be down in the root systems as well, the sedges. And then there's a lot of ground covers, the purple coral peas and the running postmans and those sort of things as well. And then there's the nectar. So it's the liquid food. Lots of, and it's just like the bees, to be honest, it's lots of colours, lots of density of flowers across the whole season. But with these guys, simple flowers they can land on. And so daisies are very good, a very simple flower they can just land on and then get their nectar from. Flat sort of simple flowers. Bluebells and things like that are very good as well. And that pollinator observatory, again, the austral stalk was very good for butterflies, the large or buttercups and different types of daisies. The hopkidenia is good as well. So there's lots of different indigenous plants, but even if you don't have to worry too much about the detail, something that has a simple flower, masses of flowers, and some good colour, then you should be fine. This will be in your handouts, so just a list of trees and shrubs and ground covers and wildflowers that you can plant. And just some of the more showier, bigger bushes. So lepidopterums are really good. Sweet Bassaria is very good. Callistemons and grevilleas are good as well. And avoid the butterfly bushes if you can. They are beautiful, but they can become environmental weeds. They're very attractive to butterflies, as are the lantanas as well. So just be cautious of those ones. As far as resources go, not as many on butterflies at the moment, but there is the Complete Guide to Butterflies. It's a very good guidebook. There is an app, Butterflies from butterflies.org, that you can use on your phone to help you ID the butterflies. And the Knox City Council has a created butterfly habitat garden fact sheet. That's quite a good resource as well. And don't forget, butterflies are also a part of that wild pollinator count in April. So just to summarise up, it's really about trying to reduce the amount of insecticides and pesticides that we're using. And it's really about building that additional flower resources, so food and nesting resources in our gardens. And that will help all sorts of different insects in our garden. So that's pretty much it as far as the content goes. Let me stop sharing and we'll just see what other questions we have to finish off.
Yes, we've got a couple more questions and people can keep asking questions. So Thornbills provided some more fantastic resources for us. They have said, Richard, you forgot to mention about the sustainable alternative lawns on your website. Brilliant idea for people if they still want a low maintenance lawn while providing a food source at the same time for bees.
Absolutely, although you have to let them flower. So it's more your native grasses that you will let flower. Your lawns you tend to mow before they actually flower. So yes,
Oh, and Samantha's asked, how do I stop the cabbage butterflies? Because they are my arch nemesis too.
Yeah, me too. I've resorted to netting. So I have insect netting, which I put over my hoops over my raised garden beds. They're not active in winter. So if you're growing your brassicas in winter, it shouldn't be as big a problem. But if you plant them in autumn, for me, it's about putting a bit of netting over them. And that, if it's, I'm finding, is the best way of trying to reduce the impact of them.
So if I didn't plant brassicas, would that mean I wouldn't get the cabbage moths at all?
That's correct. That's correct.
Ah, okay, so they're coming specifically for those species. So it's all those broccolis I've been planting.
It's the broccoli, cauliflower, kale, Brussels sprouts, all of those sort of broccolini, all those sort of ones that they go for.
Trisha's saying you can print out cabbage moth decoys, which I have not heard of before, but that sounds quite good.
Yes, there's a few people say that. I've also heard that they're supposed to be territorial. So if they actually see a decoy already or it's up there, they may not. But I've also heard people try it and haven't had a lot of success with it. So there's lots of those sort of, it works for one person, not another, but it's always good to have a try.
And Sharon's asked, can I use kangaroo paw stems for my bee hotel?
Potentially, yes. I've used Dianella stems in mine.
Great.
So you could potentially use those as well.
And I'm just having a look through, because some people have been popping it in the chat section too. Oh, what's my computer doing? Oh, someone is saying, I see a small grey butterfly when I let my native lawn made up of weeping grass flower. Do you know what butterfly this is?
It could be one of the little blues. It'd be very hard to tell. If it's only small, the blues are quite small, and they have that sort of grey blue type colour to them as well. So
yes,
but it'd be best to try and identify it on either the app or the get one of those resources from the libraries and see whether you can ID it.
Oh, I think I've got one more question. Maybe if people want to post some of the butterflies that they've been seeing in their garden, because it'd be wonderful to see the diversity that we've got in the Shire. And the last question that I appear to have is, for cabbage butterflies, there are some templates to print that resemble females or males. You cut them, hang them with a sticker or a piece of string, and apparently they work wonders. So we do have a fan.
There you go. Excellent.
Someone else is being quite creative. They're saying they have a large painted doll's house. Could they use this as a bee hotel?
Yes, you could. Just need to be able to fill it. So I've got, there's lots of good DIY projects you can do. So as long as it's got one end of it's open, so you can put all of your different bits and bobs in there, then yeah, absolutely. Try and have a cover over it, so it's got a roof, so that protects a little bit. So that would be it'd be good if it had a little bit of a veranda. So if it's raining, it protects the surface of the front of the hotel.
Someone has said, how about marigolds? Because they're multicoloured, can they be attractive to bees?
Yeah, absolutely. They're quite a flat flower, so they would definitely be attractive to bees. So yeah, marigolds and calendulas, all of that sort of family would be potentially very good as well. And they're a great attractor of beneficial insects into your veggie garden as well. So.
Well, thanks everyone for attending tonight. We do have a question about the recordings and handouts, so I will get all the emails from the Eventbrite link and send out the recordings and the handouts that way. We have been trying to get them on the council website, but had a bit of issues with the videos, so I'll send them out directly to everyone, and then everyone else who hadn't registered will have to wait until they come up on the council website. So thanks everyone for attending. I don't see any last minute questions, but happy planting, and make sure you take up that offer of the free plant voucher if you want to at our new Deep Creek Nursery. Thank you very much for presenting, Richard. And what do we have next week? Is it?
I think we're doing lizards next week.
Oh, so I have a lovely blue-tongued lizard that lives at my house, and I'm sure we'll learn some fabulous tips from Richard next week.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Beautiful. Thanks, everyone. Hope to see you next week.
See you later.